So hi, I'm George. I'm giving the talk on modern slavery today, as Eddie just said. Modern slavery is quite a big topic. Today we're talking about quite a specific aspect of it. But at the end, in the questions and contribution stage, feel free to ask me about sort of any wider things, because I wrote my master's thesis on this, so hopefully I'll be able to have a good answer to that. The talk is essentially in three parts. The first part, I want to talk a little bit about what modern slavery is. I think it's a term that lots of people have kind of an idea of what it is, but they might not necessarily know the origins or the politics that sort of sits behind it. So I want to talk a little bit about that. And when I do that, I'll talk a little bit about why I think that it's actually maybe not the best way to view some really complex forms of like extreme exploitation. The second part of the talk is obviously focusing in a lot more about how the Tories use modern slavery as a justification for lots of their sort of really abhorrent immigration policies, particularly Theresa May and Priti Patel do this a lot, so it's a big focus on them too. And then the final section is I want to talk a little bit about where the labour movement is on this, and what we can and should be doing a bit better to fight this. And I've just realised there should be an extra T there, but there's not. So, so what is modern slavery? I think everyone has an idea of that, as I say, but there's no sort of singular definition of what modern slavery is. It's a term that's used sort of variously by politicians, business leaders, celebrities, all sorts of people. You might have even heard that there's sort of more slaves in the world than there today than there ever has been before. And I think that that's quite a controversial and iffy statement. I'll go on to why in a little bit. It's a term that was really popularized in the 1990s, but then became a lot more significant in the 2000s, especially after 2010, especially in the UK after 2010 anyway. And it was used by all sorts of people, from Theresa May to Barack Obama to Donald Trump in sort of varying contexts and varying ways. As I say, there's no one definition, but the UN's International Organization of Migration refers to it as situations of exploitation where a person cannot refuse or leave the situation due to threats of violence, coercion, or abuse of power. And I think this is quite a useful starting place as a definition, because it highlights just how broad definitions of modern slavery can be. And the reason that they're so broad is because modern slavery isn't anything. It's not any one thing. It's an umbrella term for sort of a really wide variety of types of exploitation. So it includes forced labor, it can mean trafficking, servitude, forced marriage, caste systems, varyingly depending on what situation you come across it in. And I think that this is sort of the first real issue that I have with modern slavery as a term, is that it includes so much in one thing that it's difficult to see the nuance in any of them. And I'll talk a little bit more about that as I move into the next section. I think there are sort of three strands that bring us to the understanding of modern slavery that's kind of common in society today. The first of those is Kevin Bales, who is an American academic at Nottingham University. He goes to a conference in the 90s and he picks up a leaflet which says there are millions of slaves in the world today. And for him, it becomes sort of a real like sticking point, and he researches it for years and years. He still is. And it's sort of like, if you read his stuff about it now, he talks about the early days of it as sort of a crusade against these people who didn't believe it existed in the world. And he writes this book, which is called Disposable People, New Slavery in the Global Economy. And in that book, which got really popular and got lots of attention, he distinguishes between new and old slavery. And so old slavery is obviously the slave trade and the enslavement of people and in Africa, where a person could literally be owned as property. New slavery, on the other hand, isn't about owning someone necessarily. It's about being able to use them as cheaply as possible for a short term, and then being able to get rid of them when you're done. And for Bales, it's not part of the regular functioning of the capitalist economy. It's this sort of shady underbelly and a crime which operates outside of that. As time's gone on, Bales has actually distanced himself from this like dichotomy between the two a little bit, but it's important because it's stuck in the minds of politicians and the public, and it is basically where we get the idea of modern slavery from, even though he calls it new slavery at the time. I think there's a couple of things that are important to draw out from this. The first is I think that the way that it links historic slavery with modern slavery is actually quite depoliticizing. I think that by making claims that the struggle against modern slavery is just a contemporary version of the struggle against historic slavery, you move it out of the realms of like reasonable political debate in a way that is really unhelpful, because everyone in the world, barring maybe the most vile corners of the far right, think that historic slavery was a bad thing, and we're all on the same side in that. And so it follows that if you're making this comparison between modern slavery and historic slavery, that we're all on the same side in the fight against modern slavery. And I'm not sure that's true, because when we talk about modern slavery, what we're talking about is exploitation at the sharpest edges of the global economy. And so the issue comes where we talk about this issue of modern slavery as not part of the regular functioning of the economy. Because we're talking about the sharpest edges of labor exploitation at the edges of the economy. And it happens in almost every industry in the planet. It's involved, and because it's capitalist exploitation, viewing it as differently to that. Sorry, I've lost my place a little bit here. When you start to view modern slavery, as separate to the functioning of the economy, it becomes easy to view us as all on the same side. But when you view it as part of capitalist exploitation, it becomes clear that we're not all on the same side in that, because bosses and politicians, their desire to maximize profit is always going to come first. So they will always put that first, and it can't necessarily be overcome by this idea that we're all in it together kind of thing. I think the next strand that's important for our purposes here today is a guy called Andrew Forrest, who you can see there in the middle with his cows. He is an Australian mining magnate, and his daughter goes to Nepal, and she's really shocked to find child labor and child exploitation when she goes to Nepal. And she comes back and she tells her dad about it, and her dad decides to audit his supply chain. He decides to audit his supply chain, and as he does that, he discovers that he has forced labor in his supply chain. I think, if I remember rightly, it was that the bosses in certain companies down the supply chain were withholding the migration documents, so the passports and the visas of the workers. And it spurs him on to create the Walk Free Foundation, which is his sort of NGO type thing that he founds. And the aim of that is to end modern slavery in his lifetime. And I think there's sort of an interesting parallel between these two guys. So Kevin Bales, the academic, and Andrew Forrest, the sort of big CEO billionaire. They both sort of make it their mission, and it's about them as opposed to about actually helping people in a lot of ways. But yeah, so he goes to Bill Gates, and he wants to find out how to get attention for this issue. And Bill Gates basically says you need an eye-catching number. So I don't know how much people know about Bill Gates's vaccination stuff, but he has lots of figures in there, and like that's how he grabs headlines. And so Andrew Forrest takes him up on this, and he goes and he meets up with Kevin Bales, and they create the Global Slavery Index, which is basically a method of measuring, quote unquote, the amount of slaves that there are in the world at any one time. And the first iteration of the modern slavery, the Global Slavery Index, estimates that there were 29 million slaves in the world, and then subsequent iterations have revised that estimate up and up and up, and now it sits at about 45.8 if you believe them. And it's a really eye-catching number, like eye-watering almost, and when you see that, it's not surprising to understand that it does grab attention, it does grab headlines, but the project is repeatedly criticized on a number of grounds. Its methodology is really iffy. It's inconsistently applies the criteria that it suggests are important for measuring modern slavery. It uses unverified assumptions about countries to sort of pick up these estimates, including being similar to Western Europe, whatever that sort of happens to mean, as if that could ever be quantifiable or a useful category in understanding why there would be more or less modern slavery in a place. And I think part of the reason that you can't really measure it, and part of the reason that this becomes an issue, is because, as I mentioned, it's sort of this umbrella term. It defies quantification because it's not any one thing. We're talking about something that's been identified in brick kilns in Cambodia, back streets in Italy, factories in Bangladesh, nail salons and car washes in England. And we're talking about things that range from forced marriage all the way to caste systems. And being able to usefully lump those things in together, I don't think is something that exists. I think that it causes a lot of trouble because actually what you end up with is a situation where someone is having to make judgments about what it is or isn't modern slavery, and that person is normally an academic at a Western university, for example, Nottingham. And I don't think that it does any good for solving any of those things, because it gives this idea that there's sort of a silver bullet that you can have to fix all of these really vast different experiences and these really vast different types of exploitation. And I personally am unconvinced that exists beyond, socialist revolution, etc. But that's not really helpful, from where we are now. The third thing that I think is important is at the end of the 90s, obviously the fall of communism in the USSR, Western governments get thrown into a frenzy about the idea that there would be mass east to west migration. And specifically within that, there's this idea that there would be mass sexual exploitation of women who have been moved across borders. And, that stereotype exists still in the idea of the Eastern European prostitute is quite a common stereotype. And I think that, there's evidence that it was a problem at the time. I'm not sat here saying that people weren't exploited, because when that opening happens, people were going to take advantage of it in a really horrible and negative way. But the evidence actually suggests that it was on a much smaller scale than you would have, then Western governments would sort of have you believe about it. And that actually it was more of a problem between Eastern European countries than from east to west, which never got the attention in quite the same way. And I think that that's sort of the first place that you really get this idea of trafficking as modern slavery, which is where the Tory party comes in a minute. And it really solidifies this idea that when you're tackling modern slavery, you have to tackle it through the system of borders that we have, and by making them more strict, obviously. And so that obviously brings us quite neatly onto, sorry, I'm just trying to move myself because I'm in the way now. That brings us on to the Tories and their immigration policy. And I think sometimes when people hear about modern slavery and hear about the fact that Tories talk quite a lot about it, it's almost a bit confusing, because it doesn't seem like the type of issue that would be their kind of ideal issue. It seems like a human rightsy thing that they just kind of wouldn't pay a lot of attention to necessarily. And I think there are sort of two reasons why they do. The first, as it says there, is basically straight up nationalism. I think it ties quite well into the sort of story that they like to tell themselves and the public about, the British Empire as a progressive force in the world, and we're leaders in human rights because we ended slavery first, which isn't true, but that's the sort of rhetoric that they use. And I think the other thing about it is obviously that it provides a useful moral grounding to their sort of really abhorrent immigration policies. And it basically begins with Theresa May as Home Secretary. One of her advisors was a former journalist who had written quite a lot on modern slavery, and she sort of influences Theresa May to pick up on it too. And so Theresa May begins to use it as a real moral counterweight to the hostile environment. So at the same time that she's sending out racist vans that say "Go home, migrants," she begins to talk about the needs to end modern slavery and help these people who are in these really dire situations. And you see it in her speeches as well. She really clearly plays to the right on issues of migration, especially as Nigel Farage and UKIP become really popular around the time of the 2015 election. And then she brings in modern slavery to give this kind of sense of justice and fairness to these really horrible things that she's pushing. And so basically in 2013, she announces the Modern Slavery Bill. And she talks about, ending the traffickers trade, and talks about locking up slave drivers. And I think when you look at the rhetoric that she uses around that time, it's quite easy to see that what modern slavery means for her is a chance to really push this strict law and order kind of anti-migrant agenda that the Conservatives were really going for at the time, and still are, obviously. And it's sort of, sometimes I talk about this with people and they're like, oh, do you think she actually cares about modern slavery? And basically the answer to that is it's inconsequential to me whether she cares about it. I'm sure hearing about people in really horrible situations was sad for her, but because of the policies that she was putting in are ideologically driven and actually hurt people more, it really makes no odds to me. But that's an aside. In 2015, the Act passes, and it does a couple of good things, but broadly it's not great. So one of the good things it does is it sets up kind of refuges for people who have been found to be modern slaves, which I think is good. Like, I think it does actually help people get out of a situation and give them somewhere to go outside of that. But broadly speaking, what it does is it empowers the police and it empowers immigration officials to try and act against what they see as modern slavery. And I don't think that it does anything good in that sense. And the only other thing it really does is it kind of asks corporations to audit themselves once a year. And so it's a really weak piece of legislation, but it was sort of brought into like a lot of fanfare at the time. But broadly, the underpinning of it is this sort of migrant stuff and this law and order stuff that I mentioned before. But for Theresa May, it basically is the pinnacle of her kind of career in a lot of ways. She uses it as her kind of legacy piece. And when she becomes prime minister, eventually, she talks about it lots on the global stage, and she uses it in her sort of campaign to become prime minister as well. And I think basically in a lot of ways, she sort of wanted to be seen as kind of a modern Wilberforce, the sort of like person who really spearheads like a campaign against it and finally manages to end it, rightly or wrongly. And so Priti Patel is obviously the next Home Secretary that comes in, and she basically learns from the best in a lot of ways. She does a lot of the same thing that Theresa May does. I think she is actually quite a lot more. She sides a lot more on the sort of anti-migrant law and order side of things, less than the sort of trying to justify it thing that Theresa May did, but it is still there. So, for example, she talks about like breaking the business model of traffickers quite a lot, despite the fact that none of their policies do anything towards breaking the business model of that. When 39 migrants were found dead in the back of a lorry in Kent, she spoke of the need to tackle trafficking just 3 hours after their deaths were discovered. And that was before anyone could have had actually any idea whether those people were trafficked or whether they were migrants that had moved clandestinely. It was before it had even been found out that they were Vietnamese migrants and not Chinese migrants, which was what was reported in the first place. So she's talking there about this before she can have any idea. And I think it's interesting because there's a sort of second case a few months later where a very similar thing happens, where there's a number of men found in the back of a van and they're struggling to breathe, but because they survive, the speech that she gives afterwards is a lot more about, this is illegal immigration. We need to like crack down harder on it. And the only difference in those situations, literally the only difference in those situations, is that the people survived versus the people they died. And I think that's a really interesting sort of way of understanding maybe the way that the Tory party like to use this issue to sort of underpin their kind of agenda. And then more recently, there's the Nationalities and Borders Bill, which it basically, it has an entire section of it dedicated to modern slavery. I think it's basically dedicated to making it harder for people to become recognised as modern slaves. So it gives people less time to tell the Home Office that they think that they've been in some sort of exploitative situation. It gives them less time to stay in the UK after that. And so basically what happens is people will get shipped back to sort of wherever it happens to be that they've come from, and will likely be in just as exploitative situations there, or will have to embark on dangerous sort of migration journeys again. I think it's a really bad thing and a really bad piece of legislation in a number of ways, but with regards to modern slavery, it's particularly just dreadful in terms of sort of making it more difficult for people to kind of be recognised as people who are actually in some sort of situation of exploitation. And it's been like quite widely criticised now by sort of modern slavery NGOs and stuff like that, who are really beginning to cotton onto the fact that the migration system is a really key part of what's causing and driving sort of a lot of the most extreme forms of exploitation in the UK. And so basically the problem with all of the Tory kind of approach to modern slavery is that their ideology and their approach willfully misunderstands the causes of modern slavery. And especially when it comes to trafficking, which obviously they use a lot because it is about like crossing borders. And people often think about trafficking as a situation where someone's been like abducted and kidnapped and moved across the border. And that does happen, but it doesn't happen on anywhere near the scale that you would kind of imagine. And most of the time, the exploitation that happens involving borders like trafficking is a situation of migration gone wrong. And once you begin to understand that, it becomes really clear that border regimes create trafficking because they create the opportunity for people to actually offend in that setting, in that case, because when people don't have the opportunity to move across borders, they don't stop needing to move, but you do force them into the hands of people who are willing to do really horrible things. Interestingly, the limited research that there is on who traffickers actually are is that they're generalists and not specialists. You know, they're not specialists in moving people across borders. They're generalists who might move cigarettes one week or people the next, kind of thing. I think that's interesting because there's this idea that there's sort of like really organized crime around this that you hear a lot, but I just don't think that exists in the way that people would claim necessarily. Basically, when you make borders stricter and when you make when there's too few safe and legal routes and there's a lack of regularization and no way for people to travel under the UN Convention, for example, you create a pool of people who have no way of traveling safely. And some of them might not be exploited on the journey, but a lot of them will be either on the journey or at their point of at the end, at their destination, because they have no way of accessing the country safely, and there's nowhere they can go to report exploitation without fear of being deported. And I think that's the real cruel irony of the policies that the Conservative Party believe will tackle modern slavery, is that they actually entrench further the exploitation that people who move across borders face. Because, for example, actually, if you take the planned policy of migrant pushback, so that's turning boats around in the channel, not only does that directly endanger migrants by keeping them in like one of the world's busiest shipping lanes for even longer than they absolutely need to be, it will actually make trafficking worse, because the Conservatives are probably right in one sense that it will stop some people wanting to traffic it, to move people that way, because the risk will seem too high to them. But rather than actually stopping everyone doing that, what you end up doing is leaving the people who are willing to put people in most danger. And so what you'll end up getting as well is they'll be trying to recoup costs because they're not going to get their boats back by making vessels worse. And then they'll also be able to exploit the situation and make more money off it and make more profit off it, because there will be such a higher demand for those services. So we'll end up with more packed boats than there were before that are less safe, and those people in the channel for longer. And all of those things are a real recipe for disaster, I think. I think it's basically like any other policy of prohibition, in the sense that it puts power in the hands of people who are willing to exploit others, and does nothing to really tackle the root cause. And I think that's where I want to bring us on to the labour movement and socialism and where we are with it. I think first and foremost what the labour movement needs to do is we need to recognise the role that modern slavery plays in relation to our own aims and goals. I think there's a real kind of lack of engagement in parts of the labour movement with this issue, or kind of an acceptance of this view that it's just like an individual crime that happens. And so you sort of tacitly end up accepting the kind of law and order frame that's put around it. And I think that, you know, Interestingly, when I was researching this, there are sort of things that come out from unions sort of periodically that are actually all right. You know, they're better than what government policy is at the moment. But then they don't do any sort of comprehensive campaigning around it. So you might occasionally get, you know, like Unite talking about overhauling the building sector because there's modern slavery in it. But then outside of that one issue, they don't sort of make a connection to the broader kind of situation of exploitation that goes on outside of that. And I think basically we really need to start doing that. I think also it is politicians and politicians and bosses are using the idea of modern slavery to take ground away from the labour movement, like as we speak, because they would far rather audit their company once a year than have a unionised workforce. And we need to have a better solution to that. Basically, we need to stake our claim again, rather than leaving it up to sort of conservative politicians and bosses who you know have slightly more of a conscience and will try and audit their kind of supply chain. I think we also need to be better at supporting sort of migratory workers. And there's an idea that people who migrate are really impossible to organise in terms of trade unionism, and I don't necessarily think that's right. I'm not saying it's going to be easy, but I think that, you know, if I moved to Manchester tomorrow, I could be passed to a named organiser in Manchester in my industry, and that would be able to support me in a far more robust way. If we could ever have a situation where, you know, if someone came to the UK for a season of picking, like fruit picking, they could be passed to a named organiser somewhere, and they could have their rights sort of a lot more firmly based here because they would be able to talk to someone specific. So at the moment, you know, trade union internationalism sort of tends to be sending delegates around the world to slightly iffy kind of countries a lot of the time, as opposed to actually trying to organise at a rank and file level. And I think we need to recapture that sort of organisation at a rank and file level, even as it goes across borders. I think the other thing is we need to oppose the hostile environment as it tries to sneak borders into places like hospitals and schools and councils and universities, because basically if people are concerned that any institution they come across is going to deport them, they're not going to report the fact that they think they're being exploited in any way. Another thing is I think we need to be campaigning for the decriminalisation of sex work. A lot of unions actually have quite good policy on this, but the sort of campaigning side of it is really weak. I've not spoken much about sex work today, so if anyone wants to ask me, I'll try and explain a little bit more in a bit. But basically, I think that it in both directions it makes life worse. So it makes life worse for people who are sex workers, and it makes life worse for people who are actually trafficked for sex. That sex work is criminalised, and modern slavery is then used to sort of as a justification for that criminalisation a lot of the time. I think the basic principle of everything that I've talked about here today is that where you have lots of labour abuses, you have a breeding ground for really severe cases of exploitation. And the role of socialists and the labour movement should be to stop that breeding ground existing. We should be setting out our stall as the frontline defenders of all of those people in the workforce, no matter where they are. And like, I know we're a long way off that, you know, we're in a pretty dire straits in a lot of ways, but I think that's really where our sights need to be in terms of trying to take ground back from conservative politicians who basically have no idea what they're talking about.